Recently, Betsy and I were in Florida, and I saw a T-shirt with a John Wayne quote on it. Said this: "Life is tough. It's tougher if you're stupid." I think you'd all agree we've done our share of stupid. I know I have. And when I've been stupid, it's made my life a lot more difficult, complicated, and painful. But you know what? You can do everything right, and life is still going to be hard. In Eden, there was no sickness, sorrow, pain, suffering, or death. In heaven, there will be no sickness, sorrow, pain, suffering, or death. But as Steelers Will put it back in 1972, here I am stuck in the middle with you. In between Eden and heaven is a lifetime that'll be filled with lots of pain, disappointments, betrayal, and loss. Jesus never promised us a pain-free life here, John 16:33. He did promise to enter into our pain with us, Hebrews 13:5. He promised to give us the needed strength to survive our pain, 1 Corinthians 10:13 and 2 Corinthians 12:9. He promised to use that pain to transform us into the people that He created us to be, Deuteronomy 25:3, James 1:2-4, Romans 5:2-5, and 8:28-29. And in Galatians 1:4, He promised one day to deliver us from this present evil age. God doesn't cause the hurts, but He never wastes one. God's goal is to make us like Himself. Becoming the real you that you were created to be, means developing God's character. Romans 8:28-9 says that everything that happens in our lives, good and bad, God uses it to make us like His Son. 1 John 3:2 tells us that in heaven He will finish that work and we'll be like Him. The problem is this: most people's goal in life, their highest priority, is to avoid pain and feel good. Anybody want to challenge that? For the most part, that's people's highest priority and greatest goal. Avoid pain, feel good, be happy. And they think that since God is supposed to love them, that their avoiding pain and feeling good is also His highest priority. When they have pain and don't feel happy, many believe that God has failed them and has failed at doing His job, which in their mind is to ensure His continual happiness, or their continual happiness. God's goal and highest priority in my life is not my comfort, it's my character. He wants to make me like Himself, and He will sacrifice present comfort all day long to create in me permanent character and integrity. A big part of my problem, and I'm guessing yours, is that I want my life to be easy, comfortable, and pain-free. As long as my agenda for my life is pain avoidance and feeling happy, and God's agenda for my life is developing His character in me, then as they say at NASA, we've got a problem, Houston. If pain avoidance is the goal of my life, then I'll always fight against any suffering. When I join God in His goal for my life, Christ-likeness, then difficulty becomes not something to ruin my life, but a tool to make me into the me I was created to be. Listen to Hebrews 2:10. It says, "It was fitting for Him, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation," that's Jesus, "through sufferings." He was perfected, matured, completed through sufferings. So let's talk about how God uses suffering to change us. I began this message last week. I'm going to skirt through the first 6 points, but I'm also going to read you some pieces. I've recommended a book to you called Shattered Dreams by Larry Crabb. And this weekend I thought, there's some great quotes that I ought to be using in this message. So the last 2 days I've been looking those up, and I want to use several of those, and I'll tell you when I'm doing that. Crabb says that tragedy is a necessary mile on the journey to joy. He says this: "We think our biggest problem is whatever is hindering our present happiness. Our biggest problem is that we want something or someone more than we want God." Crabb says that's our biggest problem. So we're talking about how suffering can change you. And suffering is going to change you. You'll get better or you'll get bitter. So you're never the same on the other side of suffering, but it can be something that becomes positive in your life. So let's talk about that. Number one, we can learn genuine humility. Three things under that, I realized that life is about God's story, not mine. God is not playing a part in my story where it's his job to serve me. I am playing a part in his story where it's my job to serve him. Luke 22:42, Jesus says, not my will, but yours be done. Number two, I realize my weakness and need for God's strength. When I suffer, I realize that I'm weaker than I thought I was. In Matthew 26:38, Jesus said, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. In fact, an angel came and ministered to him, the Son of God. So you'll realize your need for strength in suffering, need for God's strength. Number three, I realize that I'm not all that. In Luke 9:46, after Jesus told them he was going to Jerusalem, was going to die, they had a discussion about which of them was the greatest. Once you've really suffered, you'll be sure that it's not you. There may be a discussion like that going on around you, but you'll be sure it's not you. It'll humble you. We can learn genuine humility. Number two, we can become tenderhearted. We talked about Joseph, how he was young, had the dreams. He was the favored child. He was probably a little hot shot, but he goes through huge suffering. He then rises to power in Egypt, and we find him to be ridiculously tenderhearted. You read about in Genesis 42:24, 43:30, 45, 1-2, and 14-15, and then 50, verse 1 and 16-17. Jesus was tenderhearted. In John 11:35, he weeps with Mary and Martha. In Luke 19:41, he weeps over Jerusalem. Crabb says this, when dreams shatter, we long to experience God's nearness in a way that dries our tears. Instead, deeper tears are released. One person Crabb knows who suffered deeply said that tears have become his deepest form of worship. We can become tenderhearted. Number three, we can learn to trust God, not because we're blessed, but when we aren't. When we aren't. Job 1:21 and 2 verse 10, you see it in Job's life. In Genesis 39, 2-3, verse 5, and then 20-23, we see how it was true in Joseph's life. The Lord was with him, even though all these terrible things were happening to him. Crabb says this, the goal of the gospel is not for us to have an easy or successful life. Let me say that again. The goal of the gospel is not for us to have an easier, successful life. I'm going to do a message sometime in the future called The Gospel of Me. Because really, we think it's about us. Why does God exist? It makes us happy. Why did Jesus die? He died for me. Most of our worship isn't worship, it's thanksgiving. We sing about how much God loves us. That's not worship, that's thanksgiving. That's not about him, it's about you. If you want to sing about how loving God is, that's worship. But when you sing about how much he loves you, that's not worship, that's thanksgiving. It's about you. So he says the goal of the gospel is not for us to have an easier, successful life. The goal of the gospel is for us to love God above everything else and to trust him no matter what. Our primary goal is usually for things to go well in our lives. And it should be to become more like Jesus, whatever that requires. So we can learn to trust God not because we're blessed, but when we aren't. Number 4, we can learn to trust God not because we feel his presence, but when we can't. Matthew 28:20, Jesus talks about being with us. Same thing in Hebrews 13:5, Psalm 34:18 and 19. He's near to the brokenhearted. But we don't feel him, but he says he's there. John Ortberg says we experience the absence of the presence of God. Number 5, we can learn to trust God not because he answers our prayers, but when he doesn't. So in Psalm 39:12, 102, 1 and 2, 10 verse 1 are all examples of the psalmist crying out to God saying, where are you? I'm hurting, I need you, where are you? Why do you not come? Why do you not answer? Another Crabb quote, a profound encounter with pain brings us to make a choice. Either we change or we sink into bitterness, despair, and hedonism, which is doing whatever you can to feel good. Either we accept the fact that life is not all about us and how we feel and what happens here, or we push back the pain by living for the satisfaction of lesser dreams that might come true. See, the greatest dream in your heart is buried beneath the brokenness of your sin nature. The greatest dream in your heart is to experience God, to know him, to be like him, and to serve him. But that is buried way beneath Our lesser dreams of being happy, having a happy marriage, having well-behaved kids, having money, having nice things, having a pain-free life. Those are all lesser dreams. Those dreams have no meaning in heaven, only down here. And so that's what happens. We settle for lesser dreams. Now, number 6, which is the last one we got to last week, in suffering, we can learn to trust God, not because we have the answers, but when we don't. When we don't. In Job never understood why all the things happened to him that did. But in chapter 40, verses 24, he acknowledges, says, I'm going to shut my mouth. I'm going to quit talking. In Ecclesiastes 8:14 and 7:15, Solomon talks about the reality. That is, the truth is there's good people that bad things happen to, and there's bad people that very good things happen to. It makes no sense. Why isn't it the opposite? The good man, he suffers, and the bad guy prospers. Crab, one more time. Why is God so inconsistent, so maddeningly unpredictable? One set of parents raises a child who becomes an honor student, a youth leader. Another set, equally good, maybe even better, places their son in drug rehab. Now, stop. Am I in the real world? If you have any age on you and you have any experience with people's lives, you know this is true. You've seen parents whose kids turn out good. Sometimes the parents weren't that good. And probably if you know many people, you know somebody who did a phenomenal job parenting and their kids are a mess. He said, one man's ministry takes off. God's blessing is evident. Another man, just as godly, watches his ministry die. Why? Suffering seems so random. One dream realized, another shattered. Now, let me just stop here. Some of you I know are new here. This is a place of reality, okay? I don't wear a mask. I don't want you to wear a mask. I don't pretend. I hope that you'll quit pretending if you do pretend. I'm going to tell you the truth, okay? And sometimes it's going to cut right across the grain of what you've done or felt or thought. But I'm going to tell you the truth. And I could get up here and blow smoke up your rear end and say, if you love Jesus, you'll be healthy, wealthy, your kids will all be wonderful, the fleas will all run off your dog and go commit suicide. I could give you all this stuff. It just isn't true. I could tell you that if you get a disease, you can pray and God will heal you. That isn't true. It might be. But anybody who believes that's going to get disillusioned because it usually doesn't happen. And so I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to tell you the real world. The real world is this. Is God real? He's more real than the air you're breathing. Is His grace sufficient for your life? It absolutely is. But you're going to have pain. And you're going to have loss. And sometimes, like Jesus, you're going to be grieved to the point of death. And sometimes, like Elijah, you want God to take you home. You just can't bear to live another day. That's reality. All the apostles all followed Jesus and got them all killed. It didn't get them on the front of Time magazine. That's reality. You don't follow Jesus because of all the goodies you get by it. That's the gospel of me. You follow Jesus because there's nothing greater you could ever do with your life. That's worship. Does this make sense? So anyway, I may scare you off today, but go someplace else and somebody can tell you everything's going to be hunky-dory. And all you got to do is love Jesus and everything's going to work out right in your life. And one day you're going to be disillusioned with God because you believed a lie. The truth is, all prodigals don't come home. The truth is, all marriages don't make it. The truth is, sometimes people we love don't get healed. That's the truth. So here's number 7. Now that I've cheered you all up, you may all need to go to McDonald's for a Happy Meal after the service. Number 7, in suffering, we can learn that God really does use bad for good. He really does. And we can say that all day long till we're there, till we're in it. But God uses bad for good. Romans 8:28-29, He uses everything good and bad to make us like His Son. Deuteronomy 23:5, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loves you. In Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph tells his brothers, you meant it for evil. I'm not living in denial. You meant it for evil, but you know what? God is so good. He took the evil that you meant and He used it for good. I'm telling you, if you'll embrace your pain and suffering, if you'll seek God with all your heart, you will find Him. And you will find Him in ways you had never found Him before. And you will become somebody you would never have been without that pain. We can really learn that. You see, right now it's just theoretical. It's kind of like when we coach basketball and football games for UT or the Super Bowl from our lazy boys. We always know what they ought to do, right? Why? Because we're never tested. You know, everybody knows how everybody ought to handle everything until they have to handle it. I'm telling you, so you can say, well, I believe God works everything for good. When you're in the midst of pain and suffering and loss and you seek the Lord, you will see in all the tragedy and pain, you will see parallel to that the goodness of God. And you'll see Him in a way you've never seen Him, and you'll begin to love Him in a way you've never loved Him, and trust Him in a way you've never trusted Him. We can learn that God really does use bad for good. You can't learn that on the sideline. You can only learn that in the game. Now, number 8. We can learn to hold the things of this world lightly and to long more and more for heaven. I tell you, the more heartbreak I see in people's lives and families, the more loss I see, the more I long for heaven. Anybody in the room with me? The more I long for heaven. I'm so tired of going to funerals. I got to go to one tonight. I'm so tired of going to hospitals and people are bad. I'm so tired of somebody telling me I've got a bad report. I'm tired of people's marriages being in the ditch. I'm tired of kids breaking their parents' hearts. And that's what suffering to do. You'll quit thinking that this down here is heaven. You'll know it sure isn't, and you'll be longing for the real deal, for the real heaven. And you'll quit holding things more lightly. Joel and I had about a 2.5-hour supper or something like that. Went Thursday night, and we were talking about a lot of stuff. And he said this, he lost his son. He said, you can't imagine the things that don't matter to me anymore. How many things those are. Suffering changes you. Now, so we can learn to hold things more lightly. In James chapter 4, verse 14, it says, you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. If you remember when Joel told his story, he had told Zach, a day or two earlier, you've got your whole life ahead of you. You may not get home today. You may not. So you better live well. You better love well. You better hug a little tighter. You better appreciate a little deeper. Philippians 1:23, Paul says, I'm hard pressed in both directions. Having the desire to depart and be with Christ, that's very much better. So he says, you know what? If I'm down here, I'm going to serve the Lord. That's good. But if I die, I go to heaven. That's a lot better. That's a part of what you learn in suffering. Larry Crabb one more time. Shattered dreams subject us to a pain that weakens our stubborn grip on life as we want it, and stirs our appetite for the thrill of God's presence. So in suffering, we can learn to hold the things of this world lightly and long more and more for heaven. Corryton, I believe, is one who said, Lord, please don't let me hold things so tightly because it hurts so hard when you take them out of my hand. We talked about the Horatio Spafford story, and it is well with my soul. And the mother there on that ship gathers her 4 children. She's already buried her son, only son. Now she gets her 4 daughters and prays for God to deliver them all in this shipwreck. He doesn't. She makes it, they don't. Number 9. In suffering, we can learn that God uses broken people to bring healing to others. God uses broken people to bring healing to others. In John 12:24, Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls in the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. In Philippians 3:10, Paul says, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. Now watch this little graph right here. Here's the graph. That I may know him. Oh, that's on the upside. And the power of his resurrection. Oh, that's great. And then he starts down. And the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. Now, we'd all like the power of the resurrection. But you know what? We get that in the fellowship of his sufferings. Someone said a long time ago, I don't remember who, if God's going to use a man greatly, he must first break him deeply. Again, why? Because he realizes it's not his story, it's God's story. He realizes that he is weak and he needs God's strength, and God's strength is sufficient. And he realizes that he's not all that. He realizes it's not about him. He realizes he doesn't change anybody's life. Only God can do that. He doesn't save anybody. Only God can do that. So God uses broken people to bring healing to others. You know, in Romans 28:9, it talks about God using things for good. A part of that is the fact that he used it to make us like Christ. Another part of that is it becomes good when I have used my dilemma, my pain, my suffering, my loss to now help somebody who is in their loss. See, your pain and walking through it with Jesus ought to define what your ministry is. You've lost a child, then the rest of your life you're looking for people who've lost a child that you're going to be on their doorstep. You're going to be sitting across from them with a meal, saying, I understand. What can I do for you? How can I be here for you? And see, you couldn't do that without your own brokenness. And so God uses that brokenness to make us healers. Number 10, we can become someone that we were not before the suffering. Through suffering, we can become someone that we were not before the suffering. James 1:2-4. Consider it all joy, my brethren. This is the verse Danny quoted. All joy. That's a lot. Okay, that's every bit of it. When you encounter various trials. Why? Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. You hang on to God. You don't have the answers, but you hang on to Him. You have learned to love Him more than anything else and to trust Him no matter what. So consider all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the test of your faith produces endurance, and let its endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. In other words, you may be mature. That's how you get there. Romans 5:3-5, we also exult, rejoice in tribulations. We get excited about it. Why? Because tribulation brings about perseverance. We learn to walk with God when we don't have the answers. We learn to walk with God when we don't know where He is. We learn to walk with God when we don't know what He's doing. We're just hanging on, believing in Him. And let endurance have it. Well, I'm getting the verse together. We exult in our tribulation, knowing tribulation brings about perseverance, perseverance, proven character, and then proven character, hope. And what you saw up here in that interview a few weeks ago was hope. Two guys walking in the joy of the Lord in the midst of deep sorrow and unanswered questions. It can change you. In Hebrews 5:8, in your outline there, although He was the Son, Jesus learned obedience from the things which He suffered. I don't know exactly what that means. But it means there was something really good that came from the suffering Jesus experienced. Now, here's another crab quote, and I've got one in the conclusion. It's not natural to think the presence of Jesus has no greater purpose than to improve the quality of our journey through life. It's so natural. It's so natural to think that the presence of Jesus has no greater purpose than to improve the quality of our journey through this life. With quality defined as pleasurable, satisfying, self-affirming existence. A journey where certain things don't go wrong, or if they do, they correct themselves. Marriages should work. Biopsy should come back benign. Ministry efforts should, by the way, Larry Crabb has cancer and had it when he wrote this book. Ministry efforts should succeed. And we should feel pretty good about the way most things go. If dreams never shattered, we would continue to believe that lie and value only what God can do for us now. We would value neither His presence nor all that He intends to do later. And we would not be willing to pay the devastating price required to experience His presence now. Without trials, only spoiled brats would enter heaven, and that would turn heaven into hell. We've been spoiled brats. We got everything we wanted. Happy all the time. Everything going our way. We can become someone that we're not before the suffering. Now, you can become somebody bitter and angry and disillusioned and walk away from a God you misunderstood because you thought that his highest goal was your happiness. It never was. His highest goal is to make you like himself. And if you think it's your happiness, you're going to have a problem with God a lot. But when you realize that there's something greater to life than happiness, it's living in his presence, it's experiencing him deeply, then you can get through the not happy parts. In fact, you've heard me say this: you'll never know if you have God's joy until all your happiness is gone. Until then, you think, I've got the joy of the Lord. No, you don't. You're happy. You're healthy. Your marriage is good. Your kids are behaving. You got money in the bank. Let all of those go away and see what you're left with. And if you got God's joy, you'll still have something at the bottom of that. We can become someone we are not before the suffering. God has used suffering to change me in a way I couldn't imagine. I just never could have imagined. I couldn't have done this message 4 years ago. I could have told you some things that the Bible said about suffering, but there's no way I could have tried to reproduce in you what I'm really experienced and lived. Remember we talked about, didn't put in this week's outline, but last week, we learn emotionally through models. We see people like Danny and Joel, and we say, you know what, those guys did it, and I can do it. I can do it through God's strength. Here's the last thing, number 11. In suffering, we can experience God on a deeper level. And at the end, Job says in chapter 42, verse 5, remember all of his loss? Buried 7 children, lost a fortune, almost died. And in the end, he says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Now, suffering doesn't guarantee that all those things happen. Suffering gives you the opportunity to draw near to God, and the Bible says he'll draw near to you. To seek the Lord with all your heart, and the Bible says you'll find him. The verse in Romans 8, 28 and 9 says, and we know God calls all things to work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Literally, it's the Greek word kata, which can be translated for those who live for his purpose. That promise is not for anybody who wants to claim it. It's for people who are living for a higher purpose than their own pleasure, their own happiness, their own pain avoidance, but they're living for him. God's primary goal is our maturity. Romans 8, 28 and 29 reminds us that God uses everything in our lives to conform us to his image, his character, to the image of his Son, to make us mature. 1 John 3:2 tells us that we will be like Jesus when we see him in heaven. We will be mature, complete. Adam and Eve were like God in that they were without sin in the Garden of Eden. Talked about this Wednesday night. It's interesting that God was deliberately absent when Satan tempted Eve. He was deliberately not there. He could have been there, but he chose not to be. He's God. He knew what was coming down. He knew Satan was going to be there. He knew Satan was going to tempt her. He knew she was going to blow it, and he still chose not to be there. Isn't that interesting? Maturity requires people to take responsibility for their decisions in lives, to make decisions, good and bad, and to live with the consequences of those decisions. God was willing for Adam and Eve to be imperfect so that they could become mature. We'll say that again. He was willing for them to be imperfect. Because remember, he could have jumped in, killed Satan, destroyed him. There wouldn't have been a temptation, and they would have been sinless. But he's more concerned with us being mature than even being perfect. We enjoy our blessings. They make us happy, which is what most people want most. But they never help us grow. Our blessings usually make us feel entitled to even more blessings. Listen to this closely. We may thank the blesser, but we love the blessing. We should instead be thankful for the blessing and love the blesser. We'll say that again. We may thank the blesser, but we love the blessing. We instead should be thankful for the blessing, but we love the blesser. That's worship. Suffering, pain, trials, problems, disappointments, betrayals, unanswered questions. These things can change us for the better. They can give us depth and maturity. They can lead us past the shifting sands of happiness and place our feet on the solid rock of joy. They can bring us to the point of loving Jesus best and trusting Him no matter what. They can lead us past using God to make us happy, to make our world go well, into loving God. Past obeying God so He will bless us, into obeying God so we can bless Him. Do you see the difference? There's all the difference in the world. Most of the part we say, so if I obey the Lord, if I give, God will give me money back and bless me and take care of me. That's what the Bible says. Oh, good. So I'm going to give. I'm not giving because I love God and want to please Him. I'm giving because I think this is going to be a good deal for me, and it will be if you'll do it with the right heart. You mean if I walk with God, He'll give me an abundant life? Well, that's great. I want an abundant life. You see that? It's not about God. It's about me. How can I use God to make my life better and make my world work? When you love God, you're going to serve Him even if your life doesn't get better and even if your world isn't working. That's irrelevant. Because you're not loving and serving Him to get something from Him. You're loving and serving Him because He deserves it. He is worthy. Worthy is the Lamb. Holy, holy, holy. We move past obeying God so He will bless us into obeying God because we want to bless Him. That's the real Christian life, by the way. Crab again. 2 more paragraphs and I'll give you a break. Solid ground beneath the pain of shattered dreams is the revelation of a mystery. It's the realization that it's more difficult, listen to this, it's more difficult for Christ to restrain Himself from making all our dreams come true than for us to watch them shatter. At our moment of worst pain, Jesus' pain is worse. Now I'm going to stop and explain that. There's going to come a day God's going to bury you in blessings. Right? We're going to go to heaven. There's going to be no sickness, sorrow, pain, suffering, death. He's going to wipe every tear away from our eyes. We're going to experience the kindness and riches of His grace forever. And now He restrains Himself. Why? Because He's wanting to develop us and change us. Every dream you have, He could fulfill just like that. And not all of our dreams are bad dreams. But He restrains Himself. It's more difficult for Christ to restrain Himself from making all our dreams come true than for us to watch them shatter. At our moment of worst pain, Jesus' pain is worse. Jesus loves you more than you love you. He cares more about you than you care about you. He cares more about your wife, your children, your parents, your friends, the people you love. He cares way more about them than you do. Think about the person you love most, the best person in your world that you love most. The worst person in Jesus' world, He loves way greater than that. Crab goes on. He could make everything better. Limited power is not His problem. He is right now holding Himself back from showering us with every conceivable blessing, which He'll do in heaven. Imagine what Jesus must feel as He stands next to every bed in every hospital with a word. He could cure every patient. Is that true? What must He feel as He observes every divorce proceeding in every court? He could do something. Often He does nothing. End of crab quote. Remember that God is going to bury us in blessings in heaven. But stuck here in the middle, between Eden and then, He gives us freedom so we can try, fail, succeed, grow, mature, become like Him. Just like He did with Adam and Eve. Good parents don't always rescue their kids. The perfect parent, God, doesn't either. He lets us sow and then reap whatever we've sown. He lets us decide and experience. He's more interested in our maturity than he is our perfection. He's more interested in our character, that's his goal, than he is our comfort, which sadly is usually our highest goal. And I'll repeat this next paragraph because it's worth repeating. And never forget that he cares when it seems he doesn't. That he's good when it seems he isn't. That he's there when it seems he's absent. And that he's doing something when it seems he's doing nothing. Say that one more time, we're done. And never forget that he cares when it seems he doesn't. He's good when it seems he isn't. He's there when it seems he's absent. And he's doing something when it seems like he's doing nothing.